Hi everybody. Today we are going to learn about where it all starts, photosynthesis. So if you think about plants, they're what we call autotrophs. Auto means self and troph is how we get food, so they are self-nourishing or they make their own food. The first autotrophs filled the Earth's atmosphere with oxygen, and that allowed our ozone layer, which is O3. There's the bell. And what ozone is so important for is that the ozone layer protects us who live on land from UV rays. And so before we had an ozone layer, everything had to live in the ocean. So what are the pigments that are really important with photoautotrophs? Well, we've talked, I'm sure you've heard about chlorophyll. So there's two chlorophylls. There's a chlorophyll A and a chlorophyll B. And you can see this is visible light right here. And so you can see that chlorophyll A absorbs, oranges and blues, and chlorophyll B kind of absorbs yellow and some lighter blues. But notice that this whole center region is not absorbed by chlorophyll. So the one thing to remember is the color that you see is the wavelengths of light that aren't absorbed by the pigments but are reflected. So if you see a red apple, that means that red is reflected and other colors are absorbed. So the light harvesting part of the molecule contains electrons that are going to be boosted up to a higher energy level when light is absorbed. That's the whole goal. So chlorophyll A is the major pigment, and then also plants have chlorophyll B, carotenoids, anthocyanins, and phycobilins. So if you look at this new chart, you can see that these other accessory pigments absorb in that middle region we talked about before that chlorophyll doesn't. So if a plant has all of these accessory pigments plus chlorophyll, then it's able to absorb as much of the sun's light as it can. So we've all noticed the leaves of trees changing color. And so the reason for this is that when the plants are getting less light because it's getting darker earlier and staying darker in the morning, what happens is that the chlorophyll gets sucked into the inner part of the tree, to the stems and to the main part of the tree. And what's left are those accessory pigments. And so you see the reds and the oranges and the yellows. So chlorophyll is super important to a plant, and so it wants to conserve it as much as it can. So when the plant is not getting enough light, then that's a signal to the cells to suck in their chlorophyll to preserve it. And then you also know that these types of trees called deciduous trees lose their leaves in the fall, like the aspens. And so if they lost their leaves and all of that really important chlorophyll was in the leaves, then they would lose, they would have to make new chlorophyll. So it's an adaptation for plants. So the pigments in photosynthesis, so we've talked about kind of where do these processes happen in bacteria and prokaryotes, and then where do they happen in eukaryotes. So in bacteria, the pigments are in the plasma membranes. And so they have chlorophyll in their plasma membranes. And then in plants, we know that photosynthesis in eukaryotes happens in the chloroplast. So we're going to talk a little bit right now about how photosynthesis and aerobic respiration, which we just talked about, are related. And so photosynthesis, remember we talked about endergonic. So the products have more energy. So glucose has more potential energy in it than carbon dioxide and water. However, in aerobic respiration, we break that glucose down and get ATP and carbon dioxide and water. And so this is an exergonic. Photosynthesis releases oxygen as a byproduct, and aerobic respiration requires it. Photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, and in aerobic respiration, it releases carbon dioxide. So we'll show a picture of how these two are related. but if you need to stop the video and jot this down, then go ahead and pause it. So you should know the photosynthesis equation. If you don't, you should write it down. And I joke with students every year that you should get this tattooed, but don't really do that. But it is that important. Without photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here. So you have water and carbon dioxide that go into, those are the reactants, and then you have light energy. And then what you end up getting is oxygen, glucose, and water. So sometimes you might not see this other water over here because if you simplify this equation, you would just have water on the reactant side. So cellulose is the main structural macromolecule in plants, right? So if you cut a tree down, you're cutting through cellulose. And remember, that's a polymer and of carbohydrates. And that's made in photosynthesis. So go ahead and copy this table down and try to fill it in as we go through the lecture. So important things to know are the location of these two reactions in photosynthesis, their purpose, the reactants that go into them, and then the products. So copy that down real quick, pause the video. Okay, there's going to be a lot of drawing in this lecture, so go ahead and pause the video and draw this. This is how the two reactions in photosynthesis are linked. So you have what's called the light-dependent reactions, and then you have what's called the Calvin cycle or the sugar factory. So the light-dependent reactions, just like it says, need light, so that's where the sunlight comes in. And you also notice that this is where the oxygen for our atmosphere is made. And the plant is not trying to make oxygen for us. It doesn't do that. It's just a byproduct that we are fortunate enough to have. The other things that are made is ATP and NADPH. So the purpose of the light-dependent reaction is to take in the sun's energy, which is not usable, and turn it into chemical energy that can then be used in the Calvin cycle, and that's usable. So ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent get used in the Calvin cycle to produce glucose and other carbohydrates. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is also put into the Calvin cycle, and this is where plants absorb that carbon dioxide. Okay, so let's look at the light-dependent reaction first. So we are in the thylakoid. So if you remember back to when we were talking about organelles, there's the thylakoid membrane. Remember, chloroplast is a double membrane. So they once think that a chloroplast was its own little bacteria. Just like the mitochondria. So we're in the thylakoid membrane. So you have two photosystems, photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. And you might wonder why photosystem 2 comes first before 1. Well, photosystem 1 was discovered first, and then they discovered photosystem 2. So this is the thylakoid membrane, and inside of it is called the lumen, which I don't know if you really need to know, but outside is called the stroma, which we'll talk about later. So what happens is light comes into photosystem 2 with chlorophyll, and that causes the electron to get boosted to a higher level. Now, when that electron is boosted to a higher level, it's going to go along the electron transport chain. That should sound familiar from cellular respiration. As it goes through the electron transport chain, it pumps hydrogen ions or protons into the interior part of the thylakoid, just like in respiration. So those hydrogen ions are getting pumped through, more light comes in, boosts that electron up again, and then NADPH is formed. So NADP grabs that electron. So here NADP plus is the final electron acceptor. It gets reduced into NADPH. Okay, so the other thing that's happening is once this electron gets boosted to this other energy level, water donates an electron so that the bucket brigade, like we talked about in respiration, can keep going. So water donates its electron, and when it does, it splits into oxygen and hydrogen ions. So those hydrogen ions, remember, are really important when we're making ATP. And this oxygen right here is the oxygen that diffuses out of the chloroplast and then into the air eventually, and we breathe it. So this whole process, forming NADPH, and then remember when we have a high concentration of protons, they can go through ATP synthase and make ATP. And remember the word for that, where we have a high concentration of hydrogen ions that flow down their concentration gradient to make ATP, was called chemiosmosis. So pause the video and draw this diagram. So this is the same picture, just a slightly different way. This is the thylakoid membrane, and as you can see, remember it's a double lipid bilayer. And so this is just a good picture. Here's your whole chloroplast, and here is the thylakoid. And so that's just this blown up. So again, here comes light. This is your light harvesting complex in photosystem 2. In the last picture, those were together. The electron gets boosted out and it flows through the electron transport chain, where hydrogen ions are going to get pumped. Remember, they're going from low to high, and they're using the energy from the electrons. So this electron transport chain transports the electrons, and then this electron finally gets accepted by NADP to make NADPH. Now, I know that is very similar to NAD. The way that I remember it is this one has a P in it for photosynthesis. So NAD is in cellular respiration, NADPH is in photosynthesis because of the P. So this is your part of your energy. And then remember, all of these hydrogen ions build up and they go down their concentration gradient through ATP synthase to make ATP. So water, remember, is going to get broken apart, and it's going to donate its electron so that this whole system, electron transport chain, can keep going, and oxygen then is going to diffuse out. Okay, so what I just said is now in these words that you can copy down if you haven't been able to. So we'll just go through them real quick. This is non-cyclic because, remember, the electron starts from water and ends up in NADPH. It doesn't go back to water. Okay, so light pigments absorb photon energy from the sun, and that forces the electron out of photosystem 2. Replacement of that electron comes from the splitting of water. So here's a vocab word I want you to write down. That is called photolysis. So photo means light. So light is going to split water into oxygen and hydrogen ions or protons. And so then the oxygen diffuses out, but those protons are stuck. Because remember, charged particles can't get through a lipid bilayer. And then energy is released, or electrons are released from photosystem 2 and go through the electron transport chain. Hydrogen ions are attracted to the negative charge, and so that energy from the negative charge pumps the hydrogen ions from low to high concentration into the thylakoid, the center of the thylakoid, and then the electrons continue on to photosystem 2. So then after that, a hydrogen gradient is created, and that moves through ATP synthase to make ATP. And remember, that is called chemiosmosis, just like in cellular respiration. Electrons continue through photosystem 1 and are used to reduce, remember, reduction is gaining electrons, NADP to make NADPH. And remember, the P means it's in photosynthesis. So the energy, the light energy that's not usable, is turned into chemical energy, ATP and NADPH, that are then going to be used in a Calvin cycle to make our carbohydrates. Okay, so we've just done this whole part, right? And now we're going to talk about how NADPH and ATP are used in the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to make the ultimate thing that we need to do in photosynthesis, which is to make glucose. Okay, So go ahead and draw this picture. So this Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, which is basically like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. There's not as much detail as we went into with the light-dependent reaction, but just know that carbon dioxide comes into the Calvin cycle and it's fixed. So fixation means you're turning something that's not usable into something that's usable. So carbon dioxide is not usable to plants. But when it is combined with an enzyme called rubisco, sounds like Crisco, then it's what's called fixed, because then the cells can use it. So carbon dioxide gets fixed by rubisco, and then NADPH comes in. Remember, this is the chemical energy. ATP comes in, and then glucose is made. Now we don't stop there because we have to regenerate it so it can be a cycle. So ATP comes in and helps with the chemical reactions to regenerate so that we can do the cycle again. You do not need to know all of the different enzymes and chemicals. You might see pictures of those. You don't need to know that for this class. So here are the words that go with what I was just saying. So energy captured in the light reaction powers the Calvin cycle in making carbohydrates that the plants need. So the energy that is from the light-dependent reaction is NADPH and ATP. And then remember that this is where carbon dioxide also is taken in. So plants and other photosynthetic organisms, remember, get CO2 from the environment to make carbohydrates and glucose. So if it's an algae, then they get that carbon dioxide from the water. And if it's a plant, a terrestrial plant, then it gets carbon dioxide from the air. So nutrients and water comes from the roots and the soil, and carbon dioxide comes in from the atmosphere. Okay, so this is the picture, right? Or the table that I wanted you to try to fill in. So if you haven't filled it in, go ahead and fill it in. So the light-dependent reaction happens in the thylakoids, those pancake-looking structures. The Calvin cycle happens in the stroma, which is basically the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. The purpose of the light-dependent reaction is to capture the sun's energy and turn it into usable chemical energy that can then be used in the Calvin cycle. So it takes products from the light reaction and makes carbohydrates and glucose. The reactants of the light-dependent reaction are water, NADP plus, and ADP. And then the products of the light-dependent reaction are oxygen, NADPH, and ATP. And so then those products get used as the reactants up here for the Calvin cycle. And finally, we get glucose, which you may see as G3P. G3P is a 3-carbon molecule that can be combined to make glucose or sucrose or whatever. And then you get NADP plus and ADP, which are then going to be used into the light reaction. Okay, so this is a really complicated picture. Move mine. But I do want you to try to write this down, or find, if I know there's some things that are a little small, or find a picture and copy it down. But let me just kind of explain the amazingness of how these two are connected. So let's start with respiration and review that. So glucose, remember, and ATP and NAD, NAD plus, go into glycolysis, and they produce ATP, NADH, and remember 2-pyruvates. So the link cycle isn't shown here, but just imagine that the link acetyl-CoA and all that stuff happens, and that goes into the Krebs cycle. And into the Krebs cycle, remember, you are going to make more NADH. And you're going to make, this says FAD, FADH2, and carbon dioxide. Remember, so those are the things that get produced. And then remember the electron carriers NAD, and FAD all go into this electron transport chain where we have the hydrogen ions getting pumped across their against their proton gradient and then going through ATP synthase to make your amount of ATP. And then remember that oxygen is required as that final electron acceptor and combines with some of the hydrogens to make water. And then water goes up here, and remember, so water is formed, that's where that electron ends up, and then water is formed, and guess what donates the electron? Water. So water donates the electron, light comes in, ATP and NADPH, that's what this little truck is supposed to be, are formed. Those go into the Calvin cycle, and the carbon dioxide that was produced from the Krebs cycle goes over and goes into the Calvin cycle, and you end up with this pGal, which is the G3P molecule, and finally glucose, which then goes up into respiration. So it is all connected and pretty darn amazing, I think. Okay, so there's 3 different types of plants that you need to worry about. C3 plants are 95% of the plants on the planet. And when C3 plants get hot, they close their stomata. So the stomata, if you think of a plant leaf, the stomata are little holes that are little pores that are on the underside of the leaf. And when they get hot and dry, those plants close the stomata. And what happens in the stomata is water gets out, oxygen leaves through those stomata, and then carbon dioxide comes in. So when the plants get hot and dry, they close their stomata to retain water so they don't get dehydrated. Oxygen is going to build up, and then carbon dioxide is going to decrease because it keeps getting used in the Calvin cycle. Yeah. And so what's happening? This is a bad thing. It's called photorespiration. So this is when oxygen builds up and carbon dioxide decreases. So I found this picture. And so this is regular old Calvin cycle, right? You got carbon dioxide coming in. Here's that enzyme that's going to fix it and turn it into sugar. So when photorespiration happens, when you don't have any more carbon dioxide, then you're still making oxygen in the light-dependent reaction. So oxygen comes in, and look at, he's not happy. And what's happening is it produces this chemical, and carbon dioxide is made, and then that carbon dioxide has to go back over and do the Calvin cycle again. So basically, you need to have 2 turns of the Calvin cycle instead of 1. And so that's photorespiration. So I wrote in words right here, photorespiration is where oxygen takes the place of carbon dioxide. And this is bad because the plants can't make glucose. And the photorespiration cycle produces carbon dioxide, like I said right here, which then can be used in the Calvin cycle. And so it requires double the amount of energy to make the carbohydrates. So if you think, well, why do plants do that? Why haven't they evolved? Well, remember, we didn't have oxygen in our atmosphere in the beginning. And so this wasn't a problem. And it must not be that much of a problem, or else more plants would be different. So one type of different plant is what's called a C4 plant. So they have an adaptation. An example is corn. So they have this adaptation. So carbon dioxide comes in, right? And this is in the mesophyll, and in the mesophyll, they make this chemical called malate. And malate, they can store. So just like C3 plants, they close their stomata when it's hot and dry. And C4 plants have an extra step where they produce malate, and then malate can be broken down to produce carbon dioxide, which can then enter the Calvin cycle whenever it needs. So they have a continual supply of carbon dioxide because they store this chemical malate. So they just have an extra step that helps them so they don't have to do photorespiration. Now, CAM plants, like cactus, also do a similar thing as C4 plants. So they produce malate, and then that malate can be broken down as a supply of carbon dioxide. However, Canned plants are different because at night their stomata are open, right? At night it's going to be cooler, they're not going to lose as much water, carbon dioxide is going to come in to make malate, and then during the day the stomata are closed. So the malate can be broken down and release carbon dioxide, which can go into the Calvin-Benson cycle. So canned plants, stomata are open at night, closed in the day, but then if you talk about C4 plants, they are only closed when the plant gets dehydrated, when it's hot and dry. So it's not a night or day thing. Okay, and those are the notes that you need for photosynthesis. I hope you guys have a great day. We'll see you soon.